The calm before the storm. Captain Alyssa Carter stood at the entrance of the jet bridge, her pristine navy blue uniform neatly pressed, and her pilot's hat sitting perfectly on top of her short curls. Her calm presence exuded confidence as she smiled warmly at each boarding passenger. Years in the airline industry had prepared her for moments like these, when first-class passengers would pause, caught off guard by the sight of a black woman piloting the plane. Alyssa had encountered these moments countless times before, though they never ceased to remind her of the uphill battle she had faced in her career. The industry wasn't always kind, and it certainly wasn't always welcoming. Yet, Alyssa had navigated those challenges with grace, her skill and determination earning her the rank of captain despite the odds. The airport bustled around her, filled with travelers excited for their upcoming journeys. The air buzzed with a mix of anticipation and haste as people hurried past, minds on gate changes, luggage, and destinations. Alyssa loved the energy, the sense of purpose and movement. It reminded her of why she had fought so hard to reach this point in her life. As the last few passengers made their way to the jet bridge, Alyssa instinctively scanned the crowd, greeting each traveler with the same warmth she had shown the ones before. Some smiled back politely, while others didn't acknowledge her at all, too preoccupied with their phones or bags. Then she saw her. Alyssa's gaze landed on Susan Garrett, a woman who looked to be in her mid-40s. Her blonde hair was impeccably styled, and she wore an expensive-looking designer handbag that hung loosely from her arm. Susan's sunglasses remained on, even though the sun was nowhere to be found indoors. Alyssa had seen passengers like her many times before, those who walked through life with an air of superiority, treating first-class tickets as a license to behave without restraint. Susan's steps slowed as she approached the jet bridge. Her eyes caught sight of Alyssa's captain's bars, then drifted back to her face. Alyssa could see the shift in Susan's demeanor, the casual indifference giving way to something darker. Disbelief mixed with irritation flashed across Susan's face, and Alyssa knew the look all too well. "Are you the pilot?" Susan asked, her voice sharp, dripping with disbelief. Alyssa smiled politely, already accustomed to this line of questioning. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be flying your plane today. Welcome aboard." Susan blinked, her lips pursing tightly as if trying to make sense of a puzzle that didn't fit. Her silence was filled with an unmistakable disapproval, the kind Alyssa had learned to brush off over the years. Yet, Alyssa could tell that Susan wasn't about to let this go. Without another word, Susan brushed past her, her head held high but her shoulders visibly tense. She walked with purpose, eyes briefly darting back toward the cockpit, as if still questioning whether this situation was real. Alyssa watched her go, sighing inwardly. She had been down this road many times. Some passengers simply couldn't handle the idea of a black woman in control of their flight. But Alyssa wasn't defined by their prejudice. She was defined by her skill and experience. Today would be just another flight in a long line of successful journeys, no matter what Susan, or anyone else, thought. In first class, Susan sat down with an exaggerated huff, slamming her handbag onto the seat beside her. She glanced around the cabin, searching for someone, anyone, who might share her discomfort. But the other passengers were too busy adjusting their seats, plugging in headphones, or rummaging through carry-ons. No one else seemed to care about who was flying the plane. For Susan, however, the discomfort gnawed at her. Her thoughts raced, unable to escape the fact that Alyssa was in control of the aircraft. Could she really trust a black woman to fly the plane safely? It was an irrational fear, but one she couldn't shake. Her hands fidgeted as she buckled her seatbelt, her irritation growing by the second. The flight attendant, a young woman named Grace with a bright smile, made her way down the aisle, checking that everyone was comfortable before takeoff. As she approached Susan's seat, she noticed the woman's tense expression. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Grace asked, her tone professional yet kind. Susan forced a tight smile, clearly uncomfortable. "Yes, it's just. Do you have any other pilots on this flight?" Grace blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the question. "No, ma'am. Captain Carter is our pilot today. She's one of our most experienced." Susan's frown deepened. "I see," she muttered. "Well, I don't feel entirely comfortable with her flying the plane. Is there any way to request a different crew?" Grace paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I'm afraid there's no need for concern, ma'am. Captain Carter is more than qualified. You're in excellent hands." But Susan wasn't satisfied with that answer. She waved Grace away, muttering under her breath as the flight attendant continued down the aisle. The unease in her chest only deepened as she glanced once more toward the cockpit door. Back at the front of the plane, Alyssa had finished greeting the last of the passengers and entered the cockpit, settling into the familiar comfort of the captain's chair. The co-pilot, David, sat beside her, already running through the pre-flight checks. "Everything good out there?" David asked, sensing a slight tension in Alyssa's movements. "Just the usual," Alyssa replied, flashing a small smile. She didn't need to explain further. David had flown with her long enough to know exactly what the usual meant. He admired her ability to remain calm under pressure, especially in situations that might have rattled someone else. "You ready to get this bird in the air?" David asked, his tone lighthearted. "Always," Alyssa replied, her focus sharpening as she adjusted her headset and ran through the final checks. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Susan's anxiety only grew. She stared out the window, her mind replaying the encounter with Alyssa. Could she really trust this pilot? Could she trust someone who looked like Alyssa to fly a plane with her life in their hands? With every passing second, her doubts grew stronger. She clenched her fists, still wondering if she had made a mistake boarding this flight. But once the engines roared to life and the plane lifted gracefully into the sky, Susan's doubts would soon be tested in ways she never imagined. Turbulence ahead. The aircraft soared smoothly through the skies, climbing higher as the city below faded into a patchwork of greens and grays. In the cockpit, Alyssa Carter and her co-pilot David settled into their routine, the gentle hum of machinery a familiar companion. Alyssa's hands rested steadily on the controls, her eyes sharp and focused. She loved these moments, the calm after takeoff, where everything felt controlled, and her purpose as a pilot was clear. Back in first class, however, Susan Garrett was far from calm. She shifted uneasily in her plush leather seat, her stomach tightening with every passing minute. She couldn't shake the unease that gripped her, the irrational fear that gnawed at the edges of her mind. Her thoughts, like a storm building on the horizon, swirled with doubt and discomfort. Susan glanced around the cabin again, scanning the faces of the other passengers. Most were either engrossed in books or tapping away on laptops, completely unbothered by the fact that a black woman was at the helm. Susan's irritation bubbled beneath the surface, frustrated by the indifference of those around her. How could they be so relaxed? It didn't make sense to her. She had flown hundreds of times, always with a sense of certainty in the competence of the pilots. But this was different. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Unable to sit still any longer, Susan unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her heels clicking loudly on the floor as she made her way toward the front of the plane. Her steps were hurried, fueled by a mix of anxiety and a growing sense of entitlement. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit there and pretend everything was fine. The flight attendant, Grace, was making her rounds, collecting drink orders from passengers when she noticed Susan approaching with a determined look on her face. "Is there something I can assist you with, ma'am?" Grace asked, her smile still firmly in place. "I need to speak to the pilot," Susan demanded, her voice low but forceful, trying to avoid drawing attention from other passengers. Grace blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the abrupt request. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the cockpit is off limits during the flight. Is there something I can help you with instead?" Susan crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "I don't feel comfortable with the pilot flying this plane. I need to speak with someone in charge." Grace's smile faltered slightly, but her professionalism remained intact. "Captain Carter is highly qualified, ma'am. There's no need for concern. I assure you, you are in very capable hands." Susan's patience, already wearing thin, snapped. "This is absurd. I paid for first class, and I have a right to feel safe. And I don't feel safe with her in charge." The emphasis on her was unmistakable, and Grace's expression changed. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this situation felt different. The tension in the air was palpable, and other passengers had begun to glance over, sensing the brewing conflict. "I understand your concern, but the airline has strict policies, and Captain Carter is our assigned pilot for this flight. If you feel uncomfortable, I suggest taking your seat, and we can discuss any concerns after we've safely landed," Grace said firmly, though her tone remained respectful. But Susan wasn't having it. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. "I want someone else to fly this plane. I don't care what your policies are. This is a serious issue." Grace, keeping her composure, nodded politely before stepping away. "Please return to your seat, ma'am. I'll see what I can do." Susan huffed and reluctantly turned back toward her seat, but her mind raced with escalating thoughts of doubt and fear. This wasn't over. She wasn't going to let it be over. In the cockpit, Alyssa remained focused on the flight ahead. The sky stretched out like a vast blue canvas, clear and calm. David's voice broke the silence as he reviewed their course, making small adjustments here and there. "You okay, Captain?" he asked, his tone casual but perceptive. Alyssa glanced over and gave him a small smile. "I'm good. It's just been a long morning." David nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning behind her words. "You know, you handle this stuff way better than I would. Some of these passengers, man. I don't know how you do it." Alyssa chuckled softly, her fingers lightly tapping the controls. "It comes with the territory. You learn to let it roll off after a while. Focus on the job, not on them." David grinned. "Well, you make it look easy. I'd probably be out there punching someone by now." Alyssa laughed, appreciating his attempt to lighten the mood. "Let's just focus on getting this bird safely to its destination." But as Alyssa returned her gaze to the endless sky, a flicker of doubt crept in. She had sensed Susan's disapproval earlier, and had felt her eyes lingering with judgment. She had dealt with situations like this before, too many times, in fact, but there was always that slight sting, the reminder that no matter how far she had come, some people would never accept her. Suddenly, a slight jolt rocked the plane, interrupting her thoughts. It wasn't unusual, just a small bout of turbulence, common at this altitude. Alyssa's hands remained steady on the controls, her years of experience kicking in as she adjusted their flight path slightly to avoid further disturbance. Back in first class, the jolt didn't go unnoticed. Susan, already on edge, gripped the armrest tightly, her knuckles turning white. Her heart raced as the plane shook again, a little harder this time. Her breath quickened, and a cold sweat formed on her forehead. She couldn't take it anymore. This was a sign. Surely, something was wrong. Maybe Alyssa wasn't qualified. Maybe this was all a mistake. Without thinking, Susan leaped out of her seat again and hurried toward the front of the plane. This time, her actions were far more erratic, drawing the attention of nearly every passenger in first class. People exchanged concerned glances as Susan marched toward the cockpit door. Grace was back at her station, preparing to assist the crew when she saw Susan barreling toward her. Before Grace could react, Susan raised her voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I demand to speak to the pilot right now," she yelled, her voice shaking with panic. Grace immediately stepped in front of her, blocking her from reaching the cockpit. "Ma'am, please, you need to calm down and return to your seat." But Susan was beyond reason. Her fear and frustration had reached a boiling point. "No, I want to speak to the pilot. This plane isn't safe. She shouldn't be flying." Passengers around them were now openly watching the scene unfold, murmurs spreading through the cabin. Grace's face tightened, realizing the situation was escalating quickly. She reached for the intercom, signaling for assistance from another flight attendant. But before she could do anything more, Susan made a reckless move. In a split second, Susan shoved past Grace and lunged toward the cockpit door, pounding her fist on it with force. The metallic clang echoed through the cabin, stunning everyone into silence. "I know you're in there. I don't trust you to fly this plane. Open the door," Susan screamed, her voice shaking with raw emotion. Inside the cockpit, Alyssa and David exchanged shocked glances as the banging on the door reverberated. Alyssa's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just about racial bias anymore. This was turning into a safety concern. David reached for the radio, ready to call for assistance, but Alyssa held up a hand, her expression hardening. "Let me handle this." With calm, deliberate movements, Alyssa unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, walking toward the cockpit door as the weight of the moment settled on her shoulders. This wasn't just about one angry passenger anymore. This was about something much bigger, about proving, once again, that she belonged where she was. Alyssa opened the door, facing the chaos head-on. The breaking point. Alyssa Carter's footsteps were deliberate as she left the safety of the cockpit and stepped into the confined cabin. The tension inside the aircraft was as thick as the clouds outside. Passengers in first class were either wide-eyed or whispering amongst themselves, their attention fixed on the scene that had just unfolded. For many of them, this was the first time they'd witnessed such blatant and aggressive behavior during a flight, and it had thrown a heavy sense of unease over the entire cabin. Susan Garrett stood in front of the cockpit door, her fists clenched tightly at her sides, her face flushed with a mix of fear and frustration. The echo of her pounding on the door still reverberated through the quiet plane. Behind her, Grace, the flight attendant, remained poised but tense, her eyes darting between Susan and Alyssa, uncertain how this confrontation would end. Alyssa stopped just a few feet away from Susan, her calm presence a stark contrast to the brewing storm in front of her. She could feel every eye in the cabin on her, but her years of training and experience as a pilot kicked in. This wasn't just a test of her professionalism, it was a test of her dignity and strength. For Alyssa, this was far more than just an isolated moment. It was a reminder of the countless barriers she had already faced and broken through. But here was another one standing in front of her, personified in the form of Susan Garrett. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" Alyssa asked, her voice steady and controlled, though there was a subtle edge to it. Susan's eyes darted from Alyssa's uniform back to her face, disbelief still etched in every line of her expression. "I don't feel safe with you flying this plane," she blurted out, loud enough for the other passengers to hear. Her voice wavered, but it was laced with a determination that stemmed from her own unchecked biases. "You shouldn't be flying. You don't belong here." The words hit Alyssa like a sharp gust of wind, but she didn't flinch. She had heard it all before, though it didn't make it any less painful. Still, Alyssa had learned long ago how to navigate through these moments without letting them shatter her. She drew in a deep breath, channeling the strength that had gotten her to this point in her career. "Ma'am," Alyssa began, choosing her words carefully, "I am the captain of this aircraft. I've been flying for over a decade, and I am more than qualified to ensure the safety of everyone on board, including yours. I understand that you may have concerns, but I assure you, those concerns are unfounded." Susan crossed her arms defensively, shaking her head. "I don't care how many years you've been flying. I don't trust you. There has to be someone else. I demand that someone else take over. This isn't right." The cabin was now silent, save for the soft hum of the engines. Passengers in first class were leaning forward, hanging on every word, while those farther back were starting to sense that something was happening up front. It was as if the air itself had thickened with anticipation. Alyssa remained calm, her expression unwavering, though inside, She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had been judged unfairly because of the color of their skin or the way they looked. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Alyssa said, her voice softening but not yielding. "But I'm here to do my job. I'm here to make sure that we all reach our destination safely. That's my responsibility." Susan's face twisted into a scowl, and for a brief moment, it looked as though she was going to lash out again. But instead, she let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Responsibility? What kind of responsibility are you talking about? You're a pilot? Please. This is ridiculous. They should never have let you." Before Susan could finish, another voice cut through the tense air. "That's enough," came the firm but calm voice from one of the other passengers in first class. All eyes turned toward an elderly man sitting a few rows back. He was impeccably dressed in a suit and tie, his white hair neatly combed, and his eyes sharp with intelligence and authority. He slowly stood up from his seat, his posture straight despite his age. "You're out of line, Mom," the man continued, addressing Susan directly. "This pilot has done nothing to warrant your behavior, and frankly, your attitude is disgraceful. If you can't control yourself, perhaps you should reconsider flying at all." Susan's face paled, and for the first time since the confrontation had begun, she seemed genuinely caught off guard. The man's words hung in the air, heavy with the kind of authority that couldn't be ignored. Several other passengers murmured in agreement, nodding subtly as they watched the scene unfold. Alyssa glanced over at the man, offering him a small appreciative nod, though she remained focused on the situation at hand. Susan, on the other hand, looked as though she had been slapped across the face. Her eyes darted from the man to Alyssa, then to Grace, as if searching for some kind of support, but finding none. "I..." Susan stammered, suddenly unsure of herself. "This isn't. I just don't feel safe." Alyssa took a step closer, her voice soft but unyielding. "Ma'am, I'm asking you to return to your seat. The situation you've created is not safe for the other passengers, and I will not allow this disruption to continue. If you cannot comply, we will have to involve security when we land." There was a long, tense pause. Susan's face flushed with embarrassment, and she could feel the eyes of the other passengers burning into her. Slowly, her defiance crumbled. She took a small step back, her arms dropping limply to her sides as she glanced around, realizing that no one was on her side. Grace stepped forward again, her voice still calm but more authoritative now. "Please return to your seat, Mom." Susan swallowed hard, and with one final look at Alyssa, she turned and walked stiffly back to her seat, her shoulders slumped. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, but Alyssa tuned them out, her focus remaining on keeping the peace and ensuring the flight continued safely. The elderly man, who had come to Alyssa's defense, sat back down, giving her another small nod of approval. Alyssa offered him a quiet smile in return before turning to Grace. "Thank you," Alyssa said softly. "Let's keep an eye on her for the rest of the flight." Grace nodded, her respect for Alyssa deepening in that moment. "Of course, Captain." Alyssa returned to the cockpit, her heart still pounding slightly from the confrontation, but her hands steady as ever. She slipped back into her seat, adjusting her headset as David looked over at her with a raised eyebrow. "All good?" he asked. Alyssa nodded, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, all good." But even as she focused on flying the plane, the weight of the encounter lingered. It wasn't just about one angry passenger. It was about the broader battle she and so many others faced. The fight to be seen, to be respected, and to belong. As the plane soared higher into the clouds, Alyssa knew this flight would be remembered for more than just its destination. And despite everything, she knew she had handled the situation with the strength and dignity that defined her journey. The eye of the storm. The hum of the engines was the only sound in the cockpit as Alyssa Carter resumed her place behind the controls, her hand steady, but her thoughts still reverberating with the confrontation that had just unfolded. David, her co-pilot, offered her a sidelong glance, his brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't say anything at first. He knew Alyssa well enough to understand that sometimes silence was more supportive than words. The plane leveled out at cruising altitude, and Alyssa took a deep breath, centering herself. The moment with Susan Garrett had passed, but the emotional impact of it lingered like turbulence just beneath the surface. Alyssa had dealt with difficult passengers before, but there was something about this incident that had cut deeper than most. Perhaps it was the open hostility, the sheer entitlement, or the fact that Susan had been unrelenting in her prejudiced assumptions. Alyssa shook her head slightly, pushing those thoughts aside. Now wasn't the time to dwell on it. She was responsible for this aircraft and every soul on board. That was her focus. Everything clear up front? David finally asked, his voice casual but with an undertone of concern. Alyssa gave a small nod. Yeah, just another day in paradise. David chuckled softly, though there was no real humor in his eyes. You handled it better than I would have. I would have lost it back there. Can't afford to lose it, Alyssa replied, her tone measured. Not in this job. Not when people are counting on you to stay calm, no matter what. David gave a nod of respect, then turned his attention back to the controls. They sat in silence for a few moments longer, the routine of flying taking over, as the aircraft cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet. But then, almost as if the universe had decided to test Alyssa's strength even further, a sudden jolt shook the plane. It wasn't severe at first, just a slight tremor, the kind of turbulence that experienced pilots like Alyssa could navigate without a second thought. She glanced at her instruments, her hands instinctively adjusting the plane's course ever so slightly to compensate. Just a little bump, Alyssa murmured, more to herself than to David, but as if in response to her reassurance, the plane jolted again, harder this time. David's hands flew to his controls, his easygoing demeanor replaced by the sharp focus of a seasoned pilot. That's not just a bump, he said under his breath. Alyssa remained calm, her eyes scanning the horizon outside the cockpit windows. Dark clouds were starting to gather in the distance, an unexpected storm brewing just off their flight path. She tightened her grip on the controls and straightened in her seat. Looks like we've got some weather coming up, she said, keeping her voice steady. Let's prepare for turbulence. David nodded, already adjusting the settings to account for the change in conditions. The first step was to reroute the plane slightly to avoid the thickest part of the storm, but that was easier said than done. The storm seemed to be spreading quickly, its dark, swirling mass reaching farther than the initial forecast had suggested. Passengers are going to feel this, David said, his tone serious. I know, Alyssa replied. She reached for the intercom, preparing to make an announcement to the cabin. Back in the passenger cabin, Susan Garrett sat rigid in her seat, her earlier humiliation still fresh in her mind. She had returned to her place in first class, but the glances from the other passengers hadn't stopped. She could feel their silent judgment, and it gnawed at her. Her anger had simmered into a dull embarrassment, but the defensiveness remained, clinging to her like a second skin. She glanced out the window, her brow furrowing as she noticed the gathering storm clouds in the distance. The sky had darkened, and the once smooth flight had begun to feel slightly unstable. The plane jolted once, and Susan's grip on her armrest tightened instinctively. This is ridiculous, she muttered under her breath, as if talking to herself would somehow ease her nerves. The voice of the captain crackled over the intercom, pulling her attention. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered some unexpected weather ahead, and will be experiencing turbulence for the next several minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. I'll be monitoring the situation closely, and I assure you we are doing everything necessary to ensure a safe and smooth flight. Alyssa's calm, authoritative voice filled the cabin, and for the first time, Susan listened to it not with disdain, but with a creeping sense of vulnerability. She looked around at the other passengers, some reading, some napping, others calmly buckling their seatbelts as instructed. The woman next to her, an older lady with a kind face, smiled gently and offered a reassuring pat on Susan's hand. "These things happen sometimes," the woman said. "The pilots know what they're doing." But for Susan, that was the problem. She wasn't sure she believed that, at least, not with this pilot. Despite the woman's kindness, Susan's chest tightened, and an irrational fear began to creep into her mind. What if Alyssa didn't handle the storm well? What if this was all a mistake? Before she could spiral further into her own thoughts, the plane rocked violently, as if confirming her worst fears. The turbulence hit harder than before, shaking the plane from side to side. Gasps and murmurs filled the cabin as overhead bins rattled, and drinks spilled from trays. Susan's heart pounded in her chest, her palms slick with sweat as she gripped the armrests with white-knuckled intensity. Her breath quickened, her mind racing back to every irrational thought she had since stepping onto the plane. "This isn't safe," she whispered under her breath, her panic starting to bubble up again. Her eyes darted toward the cockpit door, the invisible barrier between her and the woman she had so little faith in. In the cockpit, Alyssa's face remained calm, but her eyes were focused and alert as the turbulence worsened. She and David worked in perfect unison, adjusting their course as the storm clouds continued to close in around them. The wind was stronger than anticipated, buffeting the plane from all sides. "Think we can climb above this?" David asked, his voice strained as he checked the instruments. "Already tried. This system's bigger than it looked," Alyssa replied, her tone clipped but steady. "We'll ride it out." They were trained for this. Every pilot was. But even the most seasoned aviator couldn't fully predict the behavior of a storm, and this one was growing more unpredictable by the second. The instruments blinked with warnings as the wind speeds increased and the clouds grew darker. The plane shuddered again, harder this time, and a loud bang echoed through the cabin as something from one of the overhead bins crashed to the floor. Alyssa tightened her grip on the controls, her mind running through the checklist of safety protocols. Despite the mounting turbulence, she remained calm. This was what she had trained for, staying composed under pressure, guiding the aircraft through any challenge. In the back of her mind, though, she couldn't help but think about Susan Garrett. That passenger had made it clear she didn't trust Alyssa, but now Alyssa was responsible for her safety, just like everyone else's. There was no room for personal feelings in this moment, just professionalism and focus. Back in first class, the turbulence had turned the cabin into a whirlwind of fear and anxiety. Passengers gripped their seats, some murmuring prayers under their breath. Even the calmest among them were now bracing for whatever came next. Susan was trembling. Her breaths came in short gasps as she clutched the armrest. She glanced at the other passengers, but none of them seemed as panicked as she was. That only made her feel worse. How could they be so calm? Didn't they realize who was flying this plane? But then, amidst the chaos, Susan's gaze fell upon a young girl, no older than 8 or 9, sitting across the aisle from her. The girl was clutching a stuffed animal, her wide eyes filled with both fear and wonder. Her mother sat beside her, whispering reassurances in the girl's ear, holding her close. The sight of that little girl, her innocent faith in her mother's words, made something inside Susan shift. For the first time, she realized how irrational her fear had become. She was so consumed by her own biases and doubts that she had allowed them to control her, to dictate her fear. And in that moment, Susan made a choice. She chose to let go, if only a little, of the fear she had been gripping so tightly. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes and forcing herself to breathe deeply. She wasn't in control. She had to trust that the person who was in control knew what they were doing. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about what someone looked like, but what they were capable of. Up in the cockpit, Alyssa and David continued to battle the elements, guiding the plane as it pushed through the storm. The turbulence wasn't over yet, but the worst of it was behind them. Alyssa glanced out the window, watching the clouds begin to thin. They were breaking through. "Almost there," she said softly, more to herself than to David, but those words carried a weight of meaning far beyond the turbulence. Through the storm. As the turbulence subsided and the plane began to level out, the cabin slowly returned to a semblance of calm. Alyssa Carter, though still vigilant in the cockpit, felt a wave of relief wash over her. The aircraft had weathered the storm, both literally and figuratively, and she knew the hardest part was now behind them. David adjusted their course, keeping a watchful eye on the instruments as the dark clouds dispersed, revealing a bright expanse of blue sky ahead. "Looks like we're finally breaking through," he said, his voice lightening with the promise of smoother air. Alyssa allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. "Good. Let's get these passengers to their destination safely." Meanwhile, in the cabin, the atmosphere was shifting as well. The initial panic had given way to quiet murmurs as passengers exchanged their thoughts on the unexpected turbulence. Some still looked pale, their adrenaline pumping, while others began to laugh nervously about the ordeal, the tension dissipating like the clouds outside. Susan Garrett sat in her seat, her mind a whirlpool of thoughts. She could still feel the tremors of the turbulence in her bones, but something deeper had shifted within her. The fear she had clung to was starting to dissipate, replaced by a mix of shame and reflection. She had allowed her biases to guide her actions, and the confrontation with Alyssa had opened a window into her own prejudice. As she looked around, she noticed how the little girl across the aisle had resumed playing with her stuffed animal, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had just unfolded. Her mother was now quietly reading a book, a sense of calm restored in their little bubble. It struck Susan that perhaps she had misjudged not only Alyssa, but also the capabilities of others around her. The flight attendant, Grace, was making her way down the aisle again, offering drinks and reassuring smiles to the passengers. She paused when she reached Susan's row, her demeanor still professional, but with a hint of empathy. "Are you feeling better now, ma'am?" Grace asked gently. Susan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her earlier outburst. "I am," she replied, her voice soft. "I'm sorry for how I acted earlier. It was uncalled for." Grace smiled kindly. "Thank you for saying that. We all have our moments, especially when we're anxious. I'm just glad everyone is safe." As Grace moved on, Susan found herself grappling with the realization that her actions had consequences, not just for herself, but for those around her. She glanced at the cockpit door, her heart heavy with the need to apologize to Alyssa. She had treated her with disdain and disrespect. And for what? Because of her own fears and biases. In the cockpit, Alyssa and David continued their conversation as they monitored the instruments. Alyssa felt a sense of pride wash over her. She had navigated the plane through a storm both literally and metaphorically. But the weight of the earlier confrontation lingered in the back of her mind. David looked over at her, a mixture of admiration and curiosity in his eyes. "You handled that passenger with grace, Alyssa. I'm not sure I could have stayed so composed." Alyssa shrugged, though a smile tugged at her lips. "It's part of the job, David. I've had to learn how to stand my ground without losing my cool. It's all about maintaining control." "Yeah, but it's not just about the plane, is it?" David replied, his gaze serious. "You've got to navigate through people's biases too. That takes a different kind of strength." Alyssa nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "It does. I know that people often come with their own preconceived notions, but at the end of the day, I just want to do my job and keep everyone safe." "Your job is so much more than flying a plane," David added. "You're a role model, whether you like it or not. You're showing that barriers can be broken." Alyssa appreciated his perspective, but it still felt heavy on her shoulders. Sometimes it feels like an uphill battle. David smiled gently, turning his attention back to the controls. "Maybe, but you're winning. one flight at a time. Back in the cabin, the passengers were beginning to relax again, the cabin slowly returning to normal. Susan felt the air shift. It was as if everyone was exhaling a collective breath. She took this opportunity to stand up, her heart pounding as she made her way down the aisle. She needed to speak to Alyssa, needed to apologize. As she approached the cockpit, she could hear the gentle hum of conversation inside. Taking a deep breath, she knocked lightly on the door, her pulse racing. Alyssa opened it a crack, her expression shifting from one of focus to curiosity. "Yes," she asked, her tone professional but warm. Can I talk to you for a moment?" Susan stammered, her cheeks flushing. Alyssa's brow furrowed slightly, but she nodded, stepping back to allow Susan to enter the cockpit. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Susan stepped inside, feeling the gravity of the moment. The cockpit was a world apart from the cabin, filled with instruments, screens, and a palpable sense of purpose. Alyssa's calm presence filled the space, and for a moment, Susan felt out of place. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," Susan began, her voice quivering slightly, "for how I acted earlier. I let my fears take over, and I didn't consider how my words might affect you." Alyssa studied her for a moment, her expression neutral but her eyes softened. "It's okay. It's understandable to feel anxious, especially during turbulence, but it's important to recognize how our words can impact others too." "I know," Susan replied, her voice trembling. "I was wrong. I judged you before even giving you a chance. I can't imagine what it must be like to be in your position, to deal with people like me." Alyssa nodded slowly. "It can be challenging, but we all have our biases. We just have to work on overcoming them. It's part of being human." Tears pricked the corners of Susan's eyes as she realized the depth of her own ignorance. "I want to do better. I want to understand more. You're an incredible pilot, and I shouldn't have doubted you." Alyssa's demeanor softened further. "Thank you for saying that. It takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong. We're all learning every day." As Susan stood there, vulnerability radiating from her, Alyssa felt a wave of empathy wash over her. This moment was more than just an apology. It was a step toward healing. It was a reminder that everyone was capable of growth, of change. "Can I ask you something?" Susan ventured, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "Of course," Alyssa replied, encouragingly. "What's it like, being a black woman in this profession?" Susan asked, her voice soft but earnest. Alyssa paused, considering her response carefully. "It's a mix of challenges and triumphs. There are days when I feel like I have to prove myself constantly, and others when I know I'm exactly where I belong. But the most important thing is to keep pushing through, to show others that it can be done." Susan nodded, absorbing Alyssa's words like a sponge. "Thank you for sharing that. I'll try to carry that perspective with me. Just remember, we all have the power to change," Alyssa said, a hint of warmth in her tone. "It's about choosing to rise above the storm." With a newfound understanding, Susan felt a sense of weight lift off her shoulders. She had confronted her fears, her biases, and in doing so, had taken a step toward becoming a better version of herself. "Thank you, Captain," Susan said, her voice steady now. "I appreciate you." Alyssa smiled, the tension easing from her shoulders. "Thank you for coming to talk to me. It means a lot." As Susan exited the cockpit, she felt lighter, the burden of her earlier actions dissipating. The world outside the plane was brightening, a metaphor for her own internal transformation. She returned to her seat, ready to face the rest of the flight with a new perspective. Alyssa resumed her place at the controls, her heart full as she refocused on the journey ahead. The storm outside had passed, and as the plane soared into clear skies, she felt a sense of hope blossoming, both for herself and for those who had the courage to change. Landing in a new light, as the aircraft continued its steady ascent into the bright expanse of clear skies, The atmosphere within the cabin shifted entirely. The turbulence that had once caused panic and fear had morphed into an air of collective relief. Passengers were now leaning back comfortably in their seats, some chatting amiably about their travels, while others flipped through magazines or settled in for a nap, the earlier chaos fading into the background of their memories. For Alyssa Carter, the pilot in command, the change was palpable. She felt a renewed sense of purpose as she navigated the plane smoothly through the serene sky. The instruments glowed softly in the cockpit, indicators of a safe journey ahead. She and David shared a brief look, a silent acknowledgement of the storm they had just weathered, not just outside, but within the hearts of those aboard. "How are you holding up?" David asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Better," Alyssa replied, her voice steady. "I think that encounter reminded me why I do this, beyond just flying. It's about representation and showing people that we can defy expectations." David nodded thoughtfully. "It's a heavy weight, but you carry it with grace. Just keep being you." "Thanks, I appreciate that," Alyssa said, a smile brightening her face. "Let's finish this flight strong." As the plane cruised smoothly toward their destination, Alyssa felt a sense of accomplishment. She was not just a pilot, but a beacon of change. Each flight was an opportunity to challenge the biases she encountered, and each passenger had a story to tell. In first class, Susan Garrett had settled back into her seat, her heart racing with the exhilaration of her newfound understanding. She had confronted her fears and biases, and now, more than ever, she was committed to embracing the lessons she had learned. No longer would she allow prejudice to dictate her perceptions. Instead, she wanted to foster a mindset of empathy and growth. As she glanced around the cabin, she noticed the little girl who had been seated across the aisle still engaged with her stuffed animal, her laughter ringing like music. Susan felt a smile spread across her face. In that moment, she realized how powerful the innocence of a child could be, how it could remind adults of the beauty in simplicity and acceptance. Turning to the woman sitting next to her, she spoke with sincerity. "You know, I really appreciate how calm everyone has been. It's refreshing to see how people can come together, even in stressful situations." The older woman nodded, her kind eyes sparkling. "Absolutely. We're all just trying to get to where we need to go. It's amazing how quickly we can adapt, isn't it?" "It really is," Susan replied, feeling grateful for this connection. "I had an experience today that made me rethink a lot of my own biases." "Oh." The woman leaned in, intrigued. "Yes," Susan began, feeling a warmth in her chest as she recounted her earlier confrontation with Alyssa. "I realized that I was judging someone based on their appearance instead of their abilities. I let my own fears take over." The woman nodded knowingly. "It's easy to do. But what's important is that you recognized it and are willing to change." "I want to be better," Susan admitted, her voice steady. "I want to learn and grow from this. It's time to challenge the assumptions I've carried for so long." The woman smiled warmly, placing a hand on Susan's. "That's the first step. Keep that mindset, and you'll inspire others to do the same." Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Alyssa continued her flight checks, glancing at the map displaying their route. They were nearing their destination, and she felt a swell of anticipation. As they descended through the clouds, she prepared to give her landing announcements, knowing this moment would carry more weight than just a standard landing. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain again," she said, her voice confident and clear over the intercom. "We're beginning our descent into our destination. I want to take a moment to thank you all for your patience during the turbulence we encountered earlier. It's not just about flying. It's about all of us working together to create a safe and enjoyable journey." In the cabin, passengers began to lean in, attentive to Alyssa's words. She continued, her heart full as she spoke. "Today, we experienced more than just weather. We faced challenges that reminded us of our own biases, fears, and the importance of compassion and understanding. Let's carry that with us as we move forward. A wave of applause erupted throughout the cabin, echoing Alyssa's sentiment. The sound filled the aircraft with a sense of camaraderie, a collective acknowledgement of shared humanity. Susan felt tears prick her eyes as she joined in the applause, a wave of gratitude washing over her. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, a sense of closure settled in. Alyssa guided the aircraft to the gate, her heart swelling with pride at what had transpired on this flight. They had weathered both literal and figurative storms, emerging stronger on the other side. Once the aircraft had come to a complete stop, Alyssa initiated the shutdown procedures, while David completed the post-flight checklist. Alyssa took a moment to breathe, allowing the gravity of the experience to sink in. She had faced a challenge that many would shy away from, but in doing so, she had fostered understanding and connection. Once they had finished, Alyssa opened the cockpit door to step out. As she did, she was met with applause from the passengers who had just endured the flight. Their expressions of appreciation filled her with warmth. "Thank you, everyone," she said, her voice steady as she took a moment to acknowledge their gratitude. "It's my honor to serve you. Your safety and comfort are always my top priority." As the passengers began to disembark, Susan approached Alyssa, her expression earnest. "Captain Carter, can I just say thank you for everything? I'm sorry for how I acted earlier, but you've inspired me to be better." Alyssa's heart swelled at Susan's words. "Thank you for saying that. It takes courage to reflect and acknowledge our biases. You're already on the right path." The two women shared a moment of understanding, the weight of the earlier confrontation lifting between them. Alyssa felt a connection to Susan, a reminder that change was possible, even in the most unexpected of places. "Safe travels," Alyssa said with a smile as Susan walked toward the exit. "You too, Captain," Susan replied, her voice tinged with newfound respect. As the last of the passengers left the aircraft, Alyssa and David shared a glance filled with mutual appreciation for the journey they had just completed. The flight had been a testament to resilience and growth, both personally and collectively. "Not bad for a day's work," David said, grinning. Alyssa chuckled softly. "You could say that, but it's more than just flying. It's about making a difference, however small." David nodded, understanding the depth of her words. "You're right. It's moments like these that remind us why we do what we do." As they wrapped up their post-flight duties and prepared to step out of the cockpit, Alyssa felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. She had not only flown a plane, she had forged connections, challenged biases, and inspired growth. "Ready to go grab a coffee?" David asked, breaking her train of thought. "Absolutely," Alyssa replied, her smile brightening as they walked down the aisle together, ready to embrace whatever came next. In the end, this flight wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about the journey taken along the way. An opportunity to learn, grow, and reflect. As Alyssa stepped off the aircraft, she carried with her a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face the world outside, knowing that every day was a chance to make a difference. And so, the legacy of one flight continued, a ripple of change that extended far beyond the cockpit and into the lives of those willing to embrace it.